is of the destruction of the first temple in Jerusalem over 2,600 years ago, in 586 BCE by King Nebuchadnezzar, and the destruction of the second temple by the Romans on the same site in Jerusalem 585 years later in the year 70 CE. Jews traditionally observe this day by fasting and reading Echa, the biblical book of Lamentations, and other texts which describe in dramatic detail the violence and horror of the destruction of the first temple, and we mourn as we collectively remember this tragedy in our people's history. The rabbis in the Talmudic era addressed the question of why. Why did the tragedy of this destruction of the temple and exile from the land of Israel happen? The rabbis in the Talmud in Tractate Gittin answer by telling the story that starts, Jerusalem was destroyed on account of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa. If you're not familiar with this story, it's after an invitation to a party is mistakenly delivered to Bar Kamsa instead of the similarly named Kamsa. Its intended recipient, Bar Kamsa, shows up at the party, deeply unwanted by the host. The host declares in front of all of his other guests, which included many sages and leaders of the community, that Bar Kamsa is his enemy before callously escorting him to the door. After suffering this public humiliation, and in an effort to punish the perpetrators, Bar Kamsa goes to the Roman king and accuses the Jews of rebelling against the Roman authorities. According to the Talmud, this ultimately led to the Romans coming in and eventually the destruction of Jerusalem. This led the rabbis to determine that the temple was destroyed due to sinat chinam, baseless hatred or senseless hatred, which they claim was demonstrated by the humiliation of Bar Kamsa and the failure of the community leaders to intervene on Kamsa's behalf. As we prepare for Tisha B'Av, I think this is a wonderful opportunity to embrace the opportunity to what I hope will be an uncomfortable conversation. My goal this evening, and I hope all of our goal this evening, is to learn skills and an approach to speaking about race with our kids that is open and authentic, that allows for questions and vulnerability, and contributes to our children's capacity to think, feel, and express themselves about race. And the conversations may at times, I think if all goes well, be uncomfortable, because that means that we are reflecting and we're questioning and we're asking the hard questions that are often hard to do. I am very excited that to lead us in this process, we have with us here this evening Dr. Diana Artis, the CEO and founder of Olive Branch Educators. She has over 25 years of experience working at both the individual and institutional level. Dr. Artis has created a diversity education program to transform institutions and assist individuals in their journey towards increased self-awareness regarding diversity, equity, and inclusion. In addition to her training as a diversity practitioner, Dr. Artis has a background in organizational development and group process towards organizational change. She has firsthand leadership experience and is skilled at designing and delivering training. Dr. Artis received her doctoral degree in counseling psychology with a focus on cross-cultural competency from Columbia University Teachers College. And we are very, very happy to have her here with us this evening. And I'd like to turn it over now, Dr. Artis, to you.
Okay, thank you for such a nice introduction. It was a pleasure to be here with you all this evening. And yeah, I'm looking forward to having a conversation about talking to our children about race. And it is often a difficult conversation. There are many layers. So with the limited time that we have tonight, I tried to come up with some highlights that will hopefully kind of get your feet wet, give you some things to think about, and encourage you to continue digging in and doing this work. So I'm going to share this screen. Okay. So, you know, in trying to think about what to talk about, I've come up with why, the what, and the how. So I'm going to share a little bit about why we talk about race with children and what is required when talking about race with children, and then how to talk about race with children. And, you know, I invite you, if you have questions, I'm only going to speak about 15 minutes so I can open it up to questions. But as I'm talking, if you have questions, feel free to type them in the chat, and I will take note and respond. Okay, so why do we do this? I'm so encouraged and in awe of the work that your community is doing. And I know that you've had this series of anti-racist discussions. And so, this conversation is in line with that. One of the steps toward becoming anti-racist is to be able to have conversations about race. And, the dialogue of race and racism are intertwined. And we know that to become anti-racist is not a binary experience, right? We go from being anti-racist or from racist to being anti-racist, but then throughout the continuum, we are working on actively becoming anti-racist. And so one of the ways that we do that is to talk about race with our children. Another reason why we should talk about race with children is because of the changing demographics in our world. And, the children that are coming up now are certainly moving about in spaces that are very different than spaces that many of us have navigated. And so it's essential that they have these tools. I mean, it's almost no longer a luxury. If we send them out without the skills to talk about race, then we're sending them out, with a deficit. And then obviously for global citizenship, a lot of our schools of higher education are requiring this in terms of admission to universities, colleges, and advanced degree work. So there's this expectation that you're in communities where you are considering these questions, where you're having these conversations. And so for that reason, we want to make sure that our children are well prepared. Okay, so what is required? So I'm going to ask you, I tend to do interactive work. So just take a minute. I'd love for people to kind of type into the chat, what does race consciousness mean to you? So I'm going to give you a minute or two to type in some responses. So I'm enjoying what I'm seeing. So I see for some, it's an awareness of people's different experiences based on their race. Awareness of the role race plays in people's lives, being curious about different experiences that people have, recognizing differences, rejection of colorblindness. Yeah, this is all good. Awareness of the experience of being the other. Okay, this is great. Being aware of how a person's background may influence their worldview. So, all good thoughts. And what jumps out for me is that most of these thoughts are kind of speaking of the perspective of the other, right? So aware of other people's race, the role that it plays in other people's lives. And what I'm going to encourage you to think about tonight as you consider having conversations with your children about race is to think about the self, right? And the assumption that I'm making are that most of the people on this call I would identify as white. And so we're going to speak about it from that perspective, not from the perspective of the other, which is where people often go, especially people who identify as white. Okay. So, when we're beginning to prepare ourselves for these conversations about race with our children, there are many things that we could consider. And so I've highlighted two to kind of just give broad strokes about. One is self-awareness. So what we just did, kind of asking yourself, like, what do I mean about this? Like, when I talk about wanting my child to be race conscious, like, what exactly does that mean to me? And so I think you want to have a clear understanding for yourself, for your family. so that you're moving in that direction. It also requires acquiring some comfort around speaking about race. So, you know, race is a topic that is difficult for many people to speak about. People of color often speak about race. They don't really have the privilege not to. So it's often our white family, friends, colleagues who are uncomfortable speaking about race. So before you prepare to engage in a conversation with your children, you definitely want to take the pulse of your own comfort around this topic. Another thing is that you want to think intentionally about race and speak intentionally about it. So to do that intentionally and also be aware of when you do it. So for example, if you think about the books that we read, you know, a lot of nonfiction, or rather fiction books, when a person's race is mentioned, it's usually someone who's not white. So the story kind of goes along, and then a character pops up in the book, and then the author will describe them, you know, their race or their ethnicity, and it's usually not white. So in our society, we often speak intentionally about race when we are speaking about people who are not white. And so that's something that you want to be aware of and see how much you may be doing that. Additionally, you want to speak intentionally about your whiteness. So it's two things, you know, paying attention to what you're saying generally about race, and when you do speak about race, are you speaking about whiteness or just kind of others? And then you want to claim your racial identity. This is really important as well. We know that you know, racial identity, racial awareness is tied up with becoming anti-racist. And again, it's this continuum. It's not a binary. And so the more you understand your identity, the more you become comfortable with your racial identity, then you will become better equipped and more comfortable having conversations with your children. Another thing that's important to think about is intersectionality. And so, you know, given the community that I'm speaking to, I decided to talk about Judaism and whiteness. We all have many different identities that intersect. And so when we do this work, we need to be aware of when they do intersect. So for someone who identifies as Jewish and white, it's important to make that separation. And there are a couple of reasons for that. So one reason is that there are two aspects of your identity, one which is a privileged identity, that would be the whiteness, and one which is an oppressed identity, that would be the Judaism. And so holding the dichotomy of those two identities is really important. Kind of thinking about it, living with it, understanding it is important as you begin to have conversations with your children. Another reason why it's important to separate the two and be aware of the intersectionality is that you want to hold space for Jews of color. So if we link the two together, if we say that they are one and the same, Judaism and whiteness, then we are excluding people who are Jewish but who are not white. And so there's a system of oppression that is happening there. Conversations about race are hard. We have to sit with the discomfort of talking about race, and in the process, avoid shelter in our marginalized identities. So what I mean by that is, you know, sometimes when I talk to, say, white women about race, they will say, well, but I'm a white woman, I'm a woman, and, you know, I'm oppressed because I'm a woman. Yes, that is true. And when they walk into a room, what people see first is their whiteness. And so if they're really wanting to work on their anti-racist space in the world, and if they really want to have authentic conversations about race, they can't hide behind being a woman. They have to acknowledge that they are white, and that is a privileged identity, and their gender is an oppressed identity. And so it's a challenge, but it's an important challenge to negotiate, to think about. Okay, so, you know, we've talked about why, we've talked about what we need to do, kind of thinking about ourselves, because we really can't jump into this unless we really are looking at ourselves, just like with anything that we teach our children, right? We want to know where we fall out on the subject. We want to have, you know, our thought process in place. We want to have a clear understanding of where we are. The same thing is true when we're talking about race. And this work is skill-based work, right? It's not about being good or bad people. It's really just developing skills. And so when we are having conversations with our children, there are a couple of things that I would recommend that we consider as we're talking. So one is that we want to talk authentically and deliberately. So you don't want it to be kind of a conversation that just kind of happens in passing. You want to get to the point where it's happening all the time, just as a matter of course, as you become comfortable with it. So remember, we talked about gaining some comfort first, and so that then you can speak authentically and deliberately with your children about it. As I mentioned before, when you're speaking deliberately and authentically, you know, how are you speaking about it? Are you naming the whiteness? Are you talking about other races? You also want to be strategic about it. So in the same way that you will teach children about other identities, so say their religion, you definitely, I'm sure, you know, they go to temple, they go to Sunday school, you're reading books, children's books, so you are strategically teaching them about their religious identity. The same strategies can be used in talking about race. So finding books, you know, TV shows, having conversations with people of different races, exposing them to different experiences. So being really strategic as you approach it so that it's not something that kind of happens haphazardly. Again, as I mentioned, you want to name race, so the race of other people, as well as whiteness. When I work with children, they are so cute when they approach me and ask, is it okay to say white? Is it okay to say black? And so they have learned somewhere along the line that it's not okay. And so our work is to help them unlearn that, yes, you know, these are just names for, you know, different aspects of identity, and it is okay to say it. So the more that parents talk about it, the increased comfort children will have. When you're talking with them about it, you also want to consider their feelings, right? So they are moving outside of their home, they're moving in a lot of different circles, and so you want to be aware of feelings that they may attach to conversations about race. You know, they may have had experiences where someone has said something to someone based on their race that wasn't kind. So teaching it, but also creating space to process with them how it feels. It's also an opportunity to challenge the stereotypes. So, you know, like a common stereotype about blacks is that they play basketball. So talking to children, you know, white children can play basketball as well. So whatever stereotypes you're familiar with or that your children might be exposed to, as you talk about race, you definitely want to address those stereotypes. It's also an opportunity to talk about fairness and unfairness, which gets into privilege and racism, which are, you know, other conversations. But as you inform yourself about those topics, as is age appropriate, you want to introduce them into the conversation. And then you also want them to know that it's an opportunity for them to create change, that as they learn these things from people that they trust, their family, that you're also teaching them ways in which they can use their knowledge, the ways that they can use their privilege to make changes in the world. You know, I want to say that children are never too young to begin these conversations. There's a lot of research that speaks about the fact that children do see race. So I was encouraged to see that some people spoke about color blindness in the chat and kind of moving away from it. I mean, that's really important. To tell children that we don't see color is not truthful, because we do. It's just that we don't want to act or treat people based on their color. And so there are two other things that I want to stress as you're talking to children about race, and then I'll pause and entertain questions. One is we really want to pay attention to the messages in our society that discourage talking about race, and there are a lot of them. One of my favorite books to use to kind of drive this home is the children's book, Brown Bear, Brown Bear. And some of you may be familiar with this book. It's a really sweet children's book, and in the book, the bear is asked what he sees. And so the bear sees a red bird and a green frog and a black sheep and a goldfish and a purple cat and a yellow duck and a blue horse and a white dog. And then at some point, we see the picture of the children, and the teacher asks the bear, well, what do you see? And the bear says, I see children. And that's all the bear says, is I see children looking at me. And so, you know, when we think about that, this is a book where at least, 10 pages, we're talking about colors of the animals. And the children are enjoying learning the colors and speaking about colors. And then they get to this page where you see 6 children, different colors, right? Different complexions, different hair, different eyes, and we don't comment on it. The teacher just says, I see children. So we are sending a message in this children's book that we don't speak about color when we're talking about people. It's okay to talk about it with animals or other inanimate objects, but not when it comes to people. And so we want to pay attention to this. We want to be aware of it as a parent, grandparent, aunt, uncle. As you're talking to children about race, you want to make yourself aware of the ways in which our society sends children at a very early age messages that this is not something to talk about. And then as a parent, you can begin to undo that. So, when I read this book my children are grown now, but when I read this to nieces or nephews, we will then have conversations about, wow, so what do let's talk about the children. Oh my goodness, like they're different colored hair, eyes, skin tone, shapes of eyes, and just kind of introduce it naturally as we're talking about the other characters in the book. And so the last suggestion along those lines is to practice, right? You just need to practice, practice, practice so that you become comfortable, so that it kind of rolls off your tongue. This is a page from I think it was like a first grade math lesson, or maybe it was an English lesson. And so, it appears to be a story about a school field trip. And in the classroom, the teacher, just as you would imagine, talked about the green trees and the red apples and, how many apples do we see? There are 5 red apples in each tree. But the teacher never spoke about the people, or when they did, they didn't talk about the color of the people. So in teaching children colors, they might say, what color is the tree? What color is the sun? What color is the sky? What color is the grass? But they wouldn't say, what color are the people? Do you see the little brown boy reaching up to get the apple? Do you see the girl who appears to be white, chasing after the cat? Do you see the other white child with blonde hair sitting on the ground? And so, when we're in pre-K and kindergarten, if we just begin to have these conversations with our children, then it becomes natural. It becomes a matter of course. It's not something that we have to force on them. And so I'm encouraging us that this is something that we should do. And that these are just some suggestions about how you can practice it. So I'm going to pause there and take any questions that you might have. And what I want you to know about me is that I have thick skin. And so you can push back, you can challenge, you can ask. I love that. And I grow as I do this work, right? I don't think we're ever expert. I have an area of expertise, but I'm always learning. And so I learn every time I do these presentations by the questions that people ask. So please do not walk on eggshells with me. It's too late for that. I need you to keep me awake. So if you want to ask a question, just unmute yourself and you can ask the question. I see someone raising her hand. Go ahead, Dolly, I think.
Yeah, I have a question. Thank you so much. So the question I have is really addresses one of the pieces that you brought up in raising a child within the Jewish community. And it's so he goes to a synagogue with a lot of people who, in my case, don't look that similar to him, but look similar, at least from the point of view of the race. And so we tried, like you're talking about, to talk about race, particularly name it when you see it, and in books, et cetera. But my concern is precisely to get to the to how to not get to that generalization, right? And so if he were here tonight and had met you, how to not think that all Black people are you, and or if we read to him a book about Rosa Parks, and so then that was a couple of years ago already, and then recently we were talking about Black people, and so that was all about Rosa Parks for him. Like that was the only frame I noticed he had. And so how to, right, or he definitely has slavery in his mind. And I just want to not help him not think that all people, even as we're naming it, to not then generalize into groups.
Okay, so that's a great question. Couple of things. The first thing I'd say is that I would start in talking about people that look like you, right? So I begin having the conversations with yourself. So talking about the fact that not all white people are the same. And looking around and saying, oh my gosh, like we're all identify as white, but look, we have different skin tone, we have different hair, different eye color. Oh, there are white people that do this, there are white people that do that. So not just focusing on the other, which is what our society kind of teaches us, is so people of color are othered, and that's when we speak about race. So really, for white families to begin speaking about whiteness and not just about the other. So if you begin talking to your child about how there's a lot of diversity in the white community, then it's just a natural, leap to talk about diversity in other communities. The second thing is that it really requires, as I was saying before, being really deliberate and strategic, because often the images of people of color that are presented do fit stereotypes, right? And so those are the messages that the world sends, that they get in school, And so our job as parents is to break those down. So reading books that are not just about slavery or civil rights or the Japanese internment, but books that just happen to have characters who are Japanese, or that just happen to have characters who are Black or Latinx. So it's really it's work, right? It's work that you have to do. It's not going to be easy. And those are some of the things that I would recommend. And so pointing out, and as you begin to have conversations, as you walk down and you're talking about, oh, this white person or Black person or, East Asian person, they will start to see that there are people of the same race who are, that they look different, they have different interests. Also, you don't want to be afraid to entertain their questions, right? So sometimes when kids ask questions, people kind of do this, right? And you don't want to do that because kids see it and they're curious. They're curious. And so you talking about it gives them permission to talk about it, and you want to welcome their questions. So the questions they're not hurtful, they're not harmful. Definitely you can engage them in the questions. I'm seeing. You're welcome.
So we have a question. Oh, sorry, you were going to look at the chat, but I just want to note that Eric Dinowitz is raising his hand also. In the
Okay, so you can just unmute yourself, Eric.
Hello.
There you go. Hi.
Hi.
By the way, that's cool.
What's up?
I love your background. That's cool.
Yeah, I'm on vacation and the water's not moving. It's
okay.
So one of the questions that I have, because we like all the things you're saying make a lot of sense. Like, we read books where it just happens to be Black, Asian, whatever characters. Talk a lot about this in school, about how I'm a teacher approaching education, but my children are 5, and so a lot of the questions I have are like, what is the appropriate age, and what do those to start talking about certain things, and then what do those conversations sound like? So, for example, one of the words I think of a lot as a grown-up, and that you spoke a lot about is privilege, and so like I get that. Can have like very deep conversations about all that and like understand different facets of it. I'm concerned that my children who like are in a community where there are people of different races and are at a school where their teachers have been from all different backgrounds and so are their friends. My concern is that I don't want to get it wrong. I don't want to talk about race wrong in a way that like erects certain barriers in their minds, for one. Like I don't want to start, like I want to celebrate diversity and like differences of backgrounds without having my children start to see people as the other, right? This big problem that you were talking about at the very beginning. I don't want my children to start seeing others as the other. And the other thing is again, that word privilege. I'm just, like, I don't like, how do I talk to my 5-year-olds, or should I, or what's the right way to say, like, hey kids, like, you're white, you're privileged, without, I am concerned about the feelings they'll have and the things they will say as a result of that. Whether that means like they feel really bad. I mean, they're 5. I don't even understand my own children. 5 years old. I don't get it. Either they'll feel really bad, like that because of their skin color they have something, or they'll start to. I'm concerned that they'll start to see themselves as not privileged, like, for, you know, whatever it is, fortunate to be in one situation, but like better. Like, I don't want my kids to think they're better than anyone. And so, yeah, so thank you for listening to my long rambling questions.
Mhm. Sure. So let me try to answer. So again, and I will keep driving this home, I think the first thing that you do is you talk about your whiteness. And if you're talking about that at home and you're having conversations about being white, then these other conversations will flow. We're not going to talk with 5-year-olds about privilege, no, and not using that kind of language. And, you know, when you say, I don't want to make mistakes, think about the times that you will make a mistake as a parent, right? We make mistakes. We're not perfect. And so I want you to not be afraid to make mistakes in this area, because you're also teaching your child that this is an area where it's okay to make mistakes. You learn from your mistakes, right? So you don't have to wait till you get it right and figure it out, because let me tell you something, once you do, it'll change. And so you don't want to be afraid to make mistakes. So for example, with a little child, you know, so I have some amazing white people in my life, family, and, you know, if they're talking, if their child is pointing out, oh, you know, Aunt Diana's brown, you know, they'll say, yeah, and we're white. And they're like, oh, and so like it's just natural, right? You know, like, oh, she has a red hat. Yeah, and you have a blue hat. And so it just becomes a very natural conversation. And then they become comfortable talking about it. And then they may ask questions about it. You know, are you doing this because you're that color? Are they doing that because that's their curiosity. Kids are curious, and we want them to be curious. You want them to talk about it. It's never too young. Once they start talking, they see color at a very young age. They do. I mean, come on. They see, you know, you're teaching them color, so they're going to see that people are different, that people look different. And so the first time they bring it up, you approach it with them, right? Or maybe you even suggest it in your conversation, you know, as a matter of course, so that it feels comfortable. And then the other stuff will come later. I mean, in terms of the privilege, like down the road when you're talking to them about it, or even, you know, depending on where the child is in terms of their maturity, you know, if you're having a conversation about other people, other races, you can talk about the fact that not everybody has access to certain things, you know, in language that they'll understand, so that you're teaching them the concept of privilege without using the words, right? And we all share some sort of privilege, right? And so definitely, you know, remember I talked earlier about two identities, your marginalized identity and your privileged identity. So even when you're talking about, you know, your Judaism and how that's an identity that is oppressed in this country, it's not an identity of privilege, right? As you're having a conversation about race, you can talk to them about the difference, and then also share that, you know, there are other people in the world who also have identities that are not privileged. So, but it has to be natural. It has to be something that you just do as a matter of course. And you don't want to, I encourage you not to worry about making mistakes. I mean, we are going to worry, right? We're parents. We want to get it right, of course. And try not to put this conversation like up here, right? It's just down here with all the other conversations. And you're going to make mistakes with your 5-year-old, and you're going to get through it, and you'll make mistakes in terms of this topic, and you'll get through it. So I hope that helps or answers.
Definitely helpful. Thank you very much.
Sure. Other questions?
Hi, I'm Neil. So one of the things I think that works well with kids is to ask them questions and to get them curious and so on. So I'm wondering if there are any types of questions that you might suggest, or things to stimulate their curiosity that could facilitate the discussion.
So how old are your children? Do you have children?
No, I'm not. I mean, I do. They're older. They're but
We'll have a conversation with them. I
yeah,
mean,
yeah. They're teaching me at this point.
Okay, good. So then ask them questions like, what do you need to learn? No, but in the same way, kind of like what I talked about the book, The Brown Bear, and just kind of, advance it to an older child. But that's how you stimulate conversation. So you're looking at the book and you say, oh my gosh, wow, look at all the different colors. Like, what do you think about these children? How would you describe them? So in the same way that you would have a conversation about everything else in the book, you want to include conversation about race. So it seems like an add-on because that's just the society in which we live. We want to get to the place where it's not. So for so many of us of color, it's not something that we ever think about, right? You get up in the morning and you're aware of it constantly. You never stop thinking about it. And for some people, they never have to think about it. So I think that before you can ask questions of your children, I think you need to ask questions of yourself, right? So I would encourage you to question yourself, even in your mind or with other people, as you're moving about, even like in the next day, like tomorrow when you get up after this conversation, just see how often are you thinking about your race? And when do you think about it? And why aren't you thinking about it? So get yourself engaged in a personal dialogue. And then from there, the dialogue with others will flow. Does that help at all?
Yeah, it's good. Good. I like starting off with yourself in that way.
Yeah. This is we need to start with ourselves. So great question here from Mason. Conversations around race focused on physical characteristics and young children. How does this conversation grow and take on depth as kids get older and become more and more aware of societal messages about race? I think you just continue to have those conversations, right? They just continue to grow. And how it changes, I mean, there are many ways that it can change. So someone mentioned, so say that your temple is not as diverse as the school, or your neighborhood is not as diverse as your school. That's a way to begin having conversations that's moving beyond physical characteristics. So, why are there certain people here and not there? As you're driving around, as you're moving about your life, that you're beginning to expand the conversation yourself for your children. And then, in terms of the depth, I mean, that's when we get into then the conversations about stereotypes and biases and privilege, right, as they get older. But hopefully you've laid the foundation for those later conversations. Are there books that you can recommend to begin the conversation with toddlers? Yeah, and I told Mason that I will send a list of books that he can, because I guess he follows up after the conversation, so I'll give you some books. And I'll tell you that Barnes & Noble's right now is doing a great job of listing books, because of all what's going on in the country, so certainly you can go there. But I can give you the list of some books and some websites. I mean, just going into, and here's the other thing, right? So I just had like 3 thoughts at once. Just like going to the bookstore and spending time. So one thing that comes to mind for me is that as I find books to read to young children about God and religion, I have come across many books where the topic is not about race. It's about God, yet the pictures are diverse, right? So it doesn't have to be, the topic doesn't have to be race. So look for books where the characters look different, right? And there are a lot of books out there now where people are using the illustrations to show diversity. And so that's a great way to have the conversation. You just get a book, you're reading about God, and then you flip through and you say, oh my gosh, like, look at this, look at that. I mean, there's even a great book that, is really non-denominational. It talks about God and how he makes us different color face, eyes, different types of hair. It's a great book. I'll try to get the list of that one as well. So there are just so many books out there now. I think just spending time, and maybe even with your child, just going to the bookstore, and just when we can go back out to the bookstore. I don't know what the situation is. I haven't been getting out much. But when we can get out, to just go and spend some time in the bookstore and just, cull through the books. Oh, yes. The book that I'm thinking about is called When God Made You. So I'll get the author and send it to you. Thank you, someone. My colleague is on the call here with me, so she just shared that with me. Okay, so many children are bi or multiracial. When you're aware of this, what is the best language to use? So with anybody, you want to use whatever language they use, right? And so people have to self-identify. And I'm assuming that this question means not you, but someone else who you're interacting with. And so some people say biracial, some people say multiracial. Some people who are multiracial actually identify with one race or the other. So it's not uncommon for children who are multiracial where one person is when one parent is not white, that they identify as not white. That's how society sees them. And, you know, that gets into a whole complication about what is race anyway. So you definitely want to ask the person, right? We want to know how they identify. So we don't want to impose identity on others. That's very important. Yes, Rebecca?
So I just want to say that, you know, I'm a first grade, second grade teacher in a two language program in Washington Heights.
Mm-hmm.
And I just want to say, yes, when books, that's how you bring those conversations. That's also the books give you kind of that language. And for me, it's very important, like you say, start with us. When you come to my classroom, the first thing that I put is a lot of the questions about Mexico, because I'm Mexican and I want each of them to feel comfortable and feel proud where they are from. Mm-hmm. And that's how we start making that community. And also I always share, this is my favorite author, it's Jack Keys. And he's, you know, one of the first authors who choose to write about a Black character, a child Black character, because he never saw books of different colors. So sharing that information, that personal information about the author, it really brings the children it really opened their eyes. And also I have another book that I know that is gonna give me a lot of information from what are the children thinking. And it's this book called like La Niña Bonita, the Pretty Girl. It's by a Brazilian author. But you know what, actor artist. So, and this book is about this. It's as a Black girl and a white rabbit, and the white rabbit wants to have children that are Black, and he's trying to find out how to become Black, right? And one of my questions that I asked in order to just to see what are the children thinking is like, why do you think the white rabbit wants to be as Black as the girl? And this is my usually my I would say my Latino children. Now, like, I don't know why he wants to become Black. Well, what do you mean why? No, because she's Black, and what does it mean? Why Black? And they already have these stereotypes. And this is for me the moment that I need to switch the conversation and just to expose them more to that conversation that they're saying. And for me, choosing the right literature and the language and the expression that how they're feeling, what are they feeling, what are they being the experiences with those ideas. So yeah, literature is one of the pieces that will give you that dialogue, that conversation, and just to give you kind of hints, what is your child, you know, thinking, what are their assumptions, right? So just want to share that.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing that. And it made me think that, yeah, you know, I think that parents also can have an impact on schools, right? So talking to your schools and making sure that they are having materials in the classroom that share the diverse perspective, because you know, what happens in school is very important in the minds of little children. So if these things are being discussed in school, then it adds some value to it. You know, and just having fun, like different cuisines. You know, my family and I, we eat a lot of different foods and always have. And so, you know, that's a great way. It's like, just have fun with it. And so it's, you know, you go to a restaurant, food that you don't typically eat, and you can have a great conversation about it, right? You learn about the culture, you learn about the food. So you just want this to just be a matter of course for kids. Movies, there are a lot of movies out there. And it's really important, you know, I keep going back to kind of whiteness and other cultures, European cultures, because a lot of times the pushback from, you know, our white family and friends is that they say, well, I'm not diverse, I don't have a culture, right? And so they kind of reject all these conversations. And so I really encourage them No. You have roots other than here, right? If you're not from a tribe, one of the Native Americans, then, you began somewhere else. So let's learn about that so that they also have something that is of value, and that it's not, they don't feel othered as there's all this emphasis on these other cultures that are, labeled as exotic and exciting and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, here's another. So how to address race and racial identity as not determinative but impactful to identity when speaking about race? What are we talking about beyond skin color, and how to navigate talking about cultural characteristics without stereotyping? So I think we're mixing things in here. So cultural characteristics are different than race, right? And you can have people of the same race that have different cultural characteristics. So there's a lot in there. And racial identity, I mean, there's a lot. I mean, that's like a whole conversation in and of itself. And these are all separate things that are kind of being lumped together. And race is about what you see. It is about physical characteristics, which is different than ethnicity. And those are terms that are often confused. So ethnicity is not typically something that you see, although sometimes people can determine information about our ethnicity by how we dress or so forth. But those are different identifiers. Oh, someone else is just answering. Other questions, thoughts? I mean, these are all great questions. It's a lot to think about. And, this is just kind of, I feel like, superficial, what I've shared. I mean, we could spend hours talking about this, but hopefully, I mean, I'm looking at the hours, like 9:51. Hopefully, it whets your appetite and you want to learn more. You want to be curious about more. And so I definitely will get the resources to you. And, I'm available if people want to have further conversations.
Dr. Artis, I just have one other question, and that is that I think that especially for people who present as white, that conversations around race, one of the things that's challenging around that conversation is that there's a fear of offending, of saying something wrong, of being, and so it's easier often to avoid having the conversation than to risk the vulnerability of potentially doing something that, and I think that's been alluded to in some of the questions before. I guess my question is more of a general one, which is, how do we navigate that? Like, how do we kind of develop the capacity and the confidence to be able to have those conversations, not just with our own children, but so that our own children can have those conversations in the world as we can, and to either develop the courage to have it, or to figure out what how to sort of where are the landmines so that we don't have unintended consequences of those conversations.
So the landmines are everywhere for different places for different people. I think, definitely having conversations like this, going to workshops like this, reading books. So I can also give some suggestions of books for adults to read. So I think, arming yourself and having conversations in circles of trusted people. So if you have people of color in your life, and you have a relationship where you can talk about that and they're willing to talk about it, that's a place to talk about it. You don't want to burden people of color by having these conversations. But I think if you have relationship, then people are willing to talk about it. And so there's that. But I think initially it's doing your own reading. There's a lot of stuff on the internet now. There's a lot of stuff on social media. And so, if someone is really interested, they can certainly find things to inform themselves. There are a lot of documentaries, there are a lot of movies, just making it a priority to learn about different cultures all the time, and then have conversations with people, where you feel safe, and then kind of gradually, broadening. You're going to make mistakes. Some people are going to get offended, and that just happens. But that's true about a lot of things in life, right? And so think about, how do you handle those situations? Do you give up, or do you keep, you know, pushing forward? Like, we don't want to be perfect, right? You want to let go of perfectionism. And I think kind of the hiding behind being perfect, getting it right, is because it's just difficult to do. So if we say, I can't do it until I've got it just right, till I figured everything out, then we never have to do it. So I think you just got to jump in there and you just have to do it. You have to forgive yourself. You have to make mistakes and apologize, just like in any other conversation you have, and just keep going. I hope that helped. Oh, you're welcome.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, Diana.
Mhm.
Diana is the person of color in my life who I've been able to have difficult conversations with for decades. So really, it's been a privilege, Diana, to hear you present tonight and open up this conversation for us. And as you said, it's the beginning of conversations, and this is one of a series. So thank you so much.
Absolutely. It's been my pleasure. I really enjoy doing this. So thank you for letting me have this opportunity to spend time with you. I love all the questions. It helps me grow as well. So it's been awesome.
Thanks.
Okay.
And
Love
everybody, next week, we're going to be having a 4th session, which is going to be doing some of the internal work, doing some introspective work among ourselves and the kinds of thinking and questions we should be asking each other and ourselves. And so a lot of the issues that came up and the questions and ideas that Diana was suggesting, as well as things that have come up in the previous sessions, we'll be able to follow up with next week. It will also be a facilitated conversation. And that one will be back at 8 o'clock. We made this one at 9 o'clock so that people could get their little ones to bed and join the conversation afterwards. So also thank you all for the late hour. Diana, thank you for persevering at this time. And everyone have a good night.
Okay. Take care.
Good night. Thanks.
Everybody, thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Good
So much.
night.
I love those.
Good night, everybody.
Thank you.